And that is, there's oil in Venezuela, a significant amount of oil. And America has this significant interest in where that oil goes and who that oil is funding, i.e. Hamas, Iran. Second, I would say the additional factor is the foreign influence in Venezuela. While I'm not an expert and I haven't been in any classified briefings, at least what is said publicly is connecting Venezuela far more significantly to Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, even China, operating and having a pretty large landmass to operate. And they like it better than Cuba because it's even further away from U.S. mainland.
Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm excited today to be here with Colonel Greg Thompson. He is a retired U.S. Air Force JAG officer. He spent 20 years advising senior military leaders on the legality of combat operations. He teaches criminal justice and national security at Cedarville University. Originally, when we invited Colonel Thompson on the show, it was to discuss the legality of the bombing of the Venezuela drug boats. But this weekend, we have had a complete change in that area, and don't think we're going to have that problem coming up anytime soon. So, Colonel, I appreciate you being here. Would you like to just kind of give us a summary of what you kind of saw what happened this weekend, and how that kind of changed the landscape of how we saw our policy with Venezuela?
Sure. And I guess I'll just talk factual background, and then we can talk about some of the legal issues that are being asked, and I think the administration needs to answer too. But obviously, a pretty amazing operation by military forces. My background, I worked at Indo-Pacific Command, Combatant Command, answering to the Secretary of Defense. So I've had opportunities to see kind of these planning efforts, and obviously our special operations forces, which were the pointy end of the spear Delta Force, supported by the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, who brought them in and out of Caracas, did an exceptional job. And obviously with these teams, the planning is exceptional. And I would point out for your audience, there's probably no other country in the world that could do this type of operation at distance that we did. So pretty amazing, really impressive what we did. Of course, the legal questions exist as what is the legal authorization for this type of action. We've heard Marco Rubio talk about this being a law enforcement function. Of course, the president has said we're going to take over the country, and we'll see what he means by that. I think sometimes when the president talks, we have to wait to see exactly what specifically is meant by that. And as it stands right now, the regime of Nicolás Maduro is still intact, minus Nicolás and his wife. And so we'll see how that plays out. And so that'll be really interesting to see how the U.S. handles this, particularly because we have experience from Panama and Manuel Noriega. We have experience from Saddam Hussein. And I honestly think we're probably pulling on a bit of that with leaving the current regime in place, because when we did the de-Baathification of Iraq led to a huge insurgency pretty swiftly. And so thinking about from a State Department perspective of how to do this well probably involves an election occurring soon, but probably not possible for that to be immediate, a just and fair election. And meanwhile, try not to create an insurgency by kicking out the entire regime and letting them coalesce behind an insurgency against what is going on right now. So tricky situation in Venezuela for sure. So I don't know. Does that lay down
Yeah, no,
the
no, I think it's
details?
good. I guess, and I kind of think back about like during World War II or after World War II, they had the military districts that were governed. I know Patton had a certain area that of which he was, was governing, and he was criticized for bringing in local bureaucrats or that were former Nazis that swore allegiance at least to the Nazi Party to help govern. So it seems like this is also very tricky in that area from a legal perspective of what cannot do, because if we just take it over, then that seems to me like that all we're doing is just almost making it a colony. But on the flip side of it, we can't just allow them just to pick up the pieces with a new person.
Right.
So where is that line drawn legally on the ruling piece of it? I guess the aftermath of it.
Well, I think it's important, and we've worked very hard historically, as you've mentioned, to maintain the sovereignty of these nations, because that is, I think, a legal bright line. Venezuela is a sovereign nation. It will continue to be so. So right now, with the vice president now being the president, I think we're going to have a diplomatic effort, a tricky one, but a diplomatic effort, hopefully leading to majority rule in Venezuela, which would be a democratic rule based on the last two elections. We'll see. We'll keep our eye on Maria Machado, who is a extremely courageous woman. Obviously, her surrogate, Edmundo Gonzalez, won the last election. I think that was in 2024. So there's an interesting parallel here with Panama. In Panama, if you recall, 1989 U.S. forces invade Panama. Obviously, we had the canal at that point, so we had bases on both sides of the canal. We had expats, military families, a huge U.S. presence to defend. So different in that sense, but also different was Noriega had just usurped the election. So when we invaded Panama, it was actually fairly easy to have the properly and fairly elected president of Panama take charge, because the election had just happened. This election was some time ago, so I don't think that's really a viable option. I think in that sense, and also it looks like Venezuela had a plan, just as if someone were to take our president, we have a governmental plan of succession. So they executed it looks like they executed their governmental plan of succession. But I think we've got enough U.S. pressure here that we have a significant say in how we would accept that government to operate. And that leads to some of the legal issues, to include the prosecution of Maduro in New York.
So that does lead. Is there precedent though outside of with Noriega? Which again was I don't know if that was similar, but is there precedent of going in to remove a president to under the guise of him being a drug dealer, which he was, but do we have any precedent in being able to do that? And then what prevents us from establishing that for other countries? And then what prevents other countries from doing that to us?
Right. Great question, because when we're a country like the United States, who has capabilities second to none, and having given advice in the Indo-Pacific with the rising China, which has significant capabilities, probably not this discreet and excellent as the U.S. forces, but China's a threat. And so I would often ask, would we tolerate this if China did it to us? It's a good question, because it really underlines how we want to shape international law. As to the precedent and legality of doing this, I guess I would say there's a few layers of this discussion. One is how long this pressure campaign went on for. As you mentioned, we were going to have a discussion, and we still can, about strikes on narco trafficking drug boats. But this got out of hand quickly. And so now we have Nicolás Maduro, I think, going to make his initial appearance today in New York. And so the question is, what would be the legal basis for doing that? And I think precedent's important here. You mentioned Manuel Noriega. I think that's so on point Yes, there are other examples of nation states capturing people and bringing them on trial, to include Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960, as well as a number of Mexican cartel members in the 80s when the U.S. was pretty in deep on the war on drugs. So there's precedent for this. But you asked a specific question about presidents. That's going to be or leaders of countries, a very short list because there's few of them. I think Noriega being the main example. So under international law, this would be UN Charter Article 2.4. It talks about nations shall not impugn another nation's sovereignty and change their political, basically, environment, in which certainly that is what we've done. Now, the one exception to that is Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, and that talks about self-defense. It talks about individual and collective self-defense, and it says that nothing in the United Nations Charter would prevent a nation's ability to conduct self-defense. So I think the U.S. will make a couple arguments here about the legality of doing this, and also the precedential argument of the Manuel Noriega seizure. One is this was a law enforcement action. And I think also this law enforcement action has now, this is probably an even stronger argument than Manuel Noriega. It's now connected to our national self-defense. Now, was Noriega the same type of narco trafficker? Yes. But the landscape of national security has significantly changed since 1990, I would argue. And how it's significantly changed is we have players in the Western Hemisphere like Russia, Iran. Now we have Marco Rubio commenting on Hezbollah running their Western Hemispheric operations. And all of these countries understand well, particularly China, how to operate below the threshold of the UN Charter Article 2.4, which talks about use of force. So if they can undermine and weaken our nation by not using force, i.e. narco trafficking, as one example among many, is what some might call gray zone efforts, and the U.S. has no recourse under international law, well, that seems to be a pretty good position for them. The difficulty is we are reshaping the international law to some extent to face that, but I think it's reasonable in 2026 to do that in a smart way. And I think in this case, the president gave Nicolás Maduro an off-ramp since September. It was clear to me that this was going to happen. It was interesting to see the news media, how surprised people were. I was not surprised. We don't usually mass forces, put a carrier strike group, put on social media. We're training Army forces. We're in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, it was all there. And even reports that the president had a discussion with Nicolás Maduro to depart. And so all of this is the other part of this that actually makes this mission impressive. It was a capture mission. Those are difficult. If you're catching Osama bin Laden and it's capture kill, I mean, things get hairy. Or if someone, pulls a weapon on you, you can kill them because that's the rules of engagement for the particular mission. This was clearly not that. So we look at other missions and we look at this mission. They're really the only casualties or deaths that occurred and I don't know the discrete numbers of Venezuelans, but there were some Venezuelans who engaged our forces. I'm sure they didn't have great outcomes as a result of that, but we didn't kill the head of state. We didn't kill his wife. They're now going to be on trial, and what I would argue is compared to the Venezuelan justice system, who convicted Maria Machado of treason, is a fair and just system where he will have defense lawyers and he will have the opportunity for due process in the United States courts under the charges that he's been charged with. Now, that didn't come out well for Manuel Noriega, of course, and he may be recycling some of those arguments, and now there's case law that probably is not favorable to him. But I would say that is a distinctive between the Panama invasion and this. We have a law enforcement plus a good argument, which is the argument that I think many were making and I think is compelling in 2026 on the boat strikes, the same argument. It's a national self-defense. If drugs are coming into the country and there's a concerted conspiracy to do so, then doesn't a nation state have the ability to do something to stop that? And when they make efforts short of force and those are not effective, should they not be able to use discrete force targeting those specific lines of effort from a nation state like Venezuela, which is what the United States, I think stair-stepped in from the boat strikes to the oil rigs and trying to isolate them from getting to the shore, and then to finally the removal of Nicolás Maduro.
So, being that it's law enforcement, being that we couch it under the trafficking of drugs, why is it that we chose Venezuela, or why do you think that we chose Venezuela as opposed to the Sinaloan cartel, and you mentioned Hezbollah, which is, I mean, obviously they got the ties with Iran there. You have others that are in Mexico that are pretty strong. The CJNG in Mexico. There's others in Colombia. We got all these cartels that are out there. But we don't want to do anything to impact those because we don't want to impact the sovereign, the sovereign borders of these countries. So I guess what made this so different? Was it because the president was engaged in it, or was it? I mean, you mentioned others, before that where we went in and didn't have a problem, like Eichmann, or with Israel and everything there, but. Why is this? Why was Venezuela? Why did it move to the top of the list? Mexico's been a bigger problem with it, and even prior to that, you go to Colombia with Escobar. We were only sent in as advisors then. So, why was this uniquely different?
Well, it's obviously a political calculation of the administration, because you make some good points. If we're just talking about narco trafficking, we've had great success in Colombia. It's discouraging as we sit here today, as Colombia is not quite where they were a while ago, maybe even 5 years ago. And we see the FARC growing, and Mexico cartels are a significant threat to the United States. So I would posit, based on what I've heard the administration officials say, there's more going on here than narco trafficking. And that is, there's oil in Venezuela, a significant amount of oil. And America has a significant interest in where that oil goes and who that oil is funding, i.e. Hamas, Iran. Second, I would say the additional factor is the foreign influence in Venezuela. While I'm not an expert and I haven't been in any classified briefings, at least what is said publicly is connecting Venezuela far more significantly to Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, even China, operating and having a pretty large landmass to operate. And they like it better than Cuba because it's even further away from U.S. mainland. So I think those are the political reasons the choice was made. Furthermore, you have the election piece on top of it, which I don't think you have that going on in Mexico. You certainly don't have that going on in Mexico. And finally, I think there's a messaging of this, which is, if you're in the Western Hemisphere after the new national security strategy has been issued, the President Trump is clearly adopting what we could probably just call the Trump Doctrine now, but adopting the Monroe Doctrine.
Right.
He's messaging to Mexico. He's messaging to Colombia. You need to get these cartels under control. That's your job as a sovereign nation. When you fail to do your job as a sovereign nation, we may do it for you.
So the oil is what I hear the biggest criticism, the kind of more of a leftist conspiracy theory. We're only doing it for oil. We're only doing it for that. And I agree with you that oil, where the oil was going and who it was supporting would be more of a factor than just us getting better oil and lowering our prices. But I know that would be that's a cherry on top. But as a defense attorney handling this, would it be a legitimate argument just to say the law enforcement action was just a pretext, and therefore we had no authority, no jurisdiction, and therefore get it thrown out here in a type of motion to dismiss at that level before it even goes to trial, before it even does anything? Do you think that would be the strategy, particularly with Trump's comments that he makes that can sometimes create other problems?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. And I think when I first saw this come out, and maybe you thought this too, about the location of the indictment. The Southern District of New York, with the way that New York has been indicting cases, it was surprising. But I think there's a brilliant move by the administration here, now that I've had a chance to look into it more, is that these indictments existed since 2020. And so we have a new indictment, which is superseding, but there was a 2020 indictment of Maduro out of the Southern District of New York. I think that argument is going to be extremely difficult. Now, I think you're right. He can at least say, well, but you didn't come seize me in 2020. You didn't come get me. But at the same time, there was an indictment. There was precedent. We obviously got Nicolás Maduro. And also, the problem he's going to have is the Kerr-Frisbee doctrine. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I think the Kerr case is a Supreme Court case from 1886. Frisbee's a little more recent than that. But the two cases essentially rule on the question of when someone gets into a courtroom in an untoward manner, assuming that the defense attorney could win that argument that it was in an untoward manner, does the court still have jurisdiction or not? And the court has said, outside of something that is shocking to the conscience, which is another case called Toscanino, this is not shocking to the conscience compared to the facts of Toscanino, which involve like black ops sites, torture, things like that. The court is going to not question how the person got there, but just recognize that they, in fact, have jurisdiction of the person because of their location, and the crime because of its federal, from the federal code, and that it's applicable to this particular defendant. So I think, and these are arguments that Manuel Noriega made in different ways, but I think these arguments are quite frankly going to fail as far as getting it thrown out on jurisdiction. I think his best defense is going to be in any conspiracy trying to deny any type of, knowledge of what was going on. And that's going to be difficult too at this point because of the pressure campaign. So I think the U.S. slow rolling this is going to lead to significant benefits, I think, in the trial. We'll find out.
So, part of it, and I mentioned Pablo Escobar earlier, and, we see, Noriega goes, Pablo Escobar goes, El Chapo goes, but it seems like almost every single time we have two problems. One, somebody fills in the holes, but two, it seems like drug use keeps increasing when we get rid of somebody with it from there. And I mean, I know it's glorified. We have a drug culture in the United States. It's glorified in our entertainment, music, even in our politics. We don't treat it as tragedy. We treat it as something to be almost worshipped in a way.
Right.
So in this particular situation, we remove Pablo Escobar, and again, it just gets divided up in more areas, I think, of Central and Latin America. So I guess now we see this. Is there not a fear that this is just gonna just spread it out without us actually dealing with the real issues that are happening within the United States, within our own borders? It's like it seems like we have to do both simultaneously to work. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I read an article yesterday that drug use in the U.S. was declining, which shocked me, assuming that's true. But yeah, you may want to look that up because I certainly haven't seen such an article in a while. And if true, that's encouraging. I think we have first an issue of this. We've always had this discussion about what should we stop, the supply or the demand? Obviously, both. I feel like in the United States over my lifetime, we've tried to address our drug problem. I feel like maybe recently not, but it hasn't worked. The demand for drugs is obviously significant in the United States and concerning. And this is why countries like China would like to get us drugs, because one of China's philosophies is to kill with your own hand. And so this is why this is pretty good tactic by China. So how do we stop it if we can't address our demand side, which we haven't seemed to be able to? And like you've said, we've got cultural forces going on as well that seem to glorify it at times. And we just have like a fallen man situation where we're just like, people are pursuing what is not good for them. And even though they're told this is not good for you, they continue to pursue it. So that, I think, leaves me with, why not try something different, which is in 2026, we're going to actually put immense pressure on those who attempt to bring drugs into our country and see what kind of impact that can have. And I think that's what President Trump is pursuing here. And to your point, if you kill Pablo Escobar, as we know, it's not going to do much because there's so much money here. Mm-hmm. In fact, a great example is the drug boats. We hit 40 different drug boats. I heard one interview that someone got, and they asked some of the people being hired to drive the drug boats, and they said their motto is deliver or die. So it tells you, like, there was nothing about us hitting the drug boats which seemed to be stopping the effort. To me and you, more rational, care about living, we might say, I don't think we want to take this shipment based on the risk, but that was not the conclusion there, which kind of goes to your point. If that's the way it is when we're actually killing people in drug boats, killing one leader is not going to stop the drug industry. And sadly, I find it hard to believe that it's going away. So it's going to be a question of how much pressure can the U.S. put on it? And then what can we do better inside our country to address the demand side, which sadly, as you point out, is a discouragement.
So from a strictly legal perspective, with everything ranging from the drug boats to the arrest of their president, do you see any flaws legally with what the Trump administration has been doing? And can you see that extending again to many of these other countries that are, at least at best, turning a blind eye to it, or maybe even participating in what's going on?
Well, first, the president always has a duty to make the case, I think, to the nation and to the international community of their legal basis. And America is a nation under a rule of law. I think that's incredibly important that we do that. I think Marco Rubio began to make that case, and also we've seen arguments that this could not be legal, so those are warranted to address. I've heard the president should have consulted Congress before taking action. Now, under the War Powers Resolution, it says that the president has up to 48 hours after committing U.S. forces. So I don't see how that is going to be a legal issue for the president as the commander-in-chief. I think typically he would brief the Big Eight, as they call them, prior to taking action, because they are typically known to be secure as far as information. I think he chose not to do that. I think that is within his power as commander-in-chief. So I don't think that's going to be a winning argument. The argument that I spoke of earlier, the United Nations Charter, the U.S. has ratified that. So this would be a violation of domestic and potentially international law. Although as to international, I would say, as I say to my students in national security law, espionage is not a violation of international law. It sounds unseemly to say that, but it just isn't, because nation states practice this in all manners and forums. It is a violation of a host nation, or not host in this case, but a nation's domestic law. So if somebody's caught conducting espionage, they'll be prosecuted in that country. Now, in this case, as I mentioned, and reading different materials on national security law, and to answer your previous question, there is a history of taking people in extraordinary rendition and trying them in the country that has a charge against them. There's many examples. Now, head of state examples, a little bit more limited, obviously. So the argument against this, I think, would be that the U.S. ratified United Nations Charter, and United Nations Charter Article 2.4 says that you can't do this. You can't go into a country and violate their sovereignty, even in an arrest type situation. I think the government has a good case to make as well. There's actually an Office of Legal Counsel memorandum that was issued, I think, prior to the Manuel Noriega seizure about a law enforcement action going into a country who is unable to produce the person for U.S. prosecution. In this case, it's been since 2020 that we've indicted him. He's the head of state. He's not going to turn himself in. So that's the U.S. argument. I've heard argument about that memo. Different legal scholars have different positions on that. But having said that, the administration has a solid arguable position. There are other sides to that, and the administration will have to defend their decision. But I think based on precedent, based on their ongoing efforts with the drug boats, actually, which outline this idea of national self-defense with regard to narco trafficking, I think the administration has a good argument here.
Well, Colonel, I appreciate your insight on this. And understanding kind of the history and also what's going on now and how it ties in together. I guess really time's going to tell over these next few weeks and few months. So, but I'm hopeful that this is going to have an impact on our country in a positive way, as well as for the people of Venezuela. So if anything significant changes, hopefully we can get back together and talk about it. But I appreciate you being on the program.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'd love to do that.
All right. Well, thank you again, and you have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thank you.